Very funny.
We now give you our brand new little sweetheart of swing.
You're listening to Stay Tuned, the show for animation lovers, recorded live on YouTube and also streaming on Patreon. Coming to you from Austin, Texas, I'm your host, Phil Machi. My original comics can be discovered at retailsunshine.com, and you can interact with me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook under the handles of both Retail Sunshine and Phil Machi. Also, you can keep up to date with the latest animation news by visiting this show at facebook.com/Stay Tuned Show. Thank you so much for joining me this evening on my very first venture on YouTube Live. On tonight's episode, I'll be diving into the digital world of ReBoot, the Guardian Code. All that, and you'll have a chance to share your thoughts, questions, and opinions with me, live and on the air. It's that time of year again, back to school. For those just starting high school, it's that perfect blend of awkward and nerve-wracking where familiar faces clash with strange places. But no matter how bad your first day at a new school is, it certainly can't compete with being reassigned to Classroom 0 only to discover a holographic wall that leads to a hidden room where strange equipment sucks you into a computer to fight locusts. But first, this.
Take one final look, dear sister.
I will miss this mainframe. So many memories.
Yes, but beyond mainframe lies a vast cyberverse for us to corrupt. We'll rule all of cyberspace.
Ooh, I like the sound of that.
Listen, do you hear that sound? That's the nostalgia train coming to run over your childhood. I know I've talked about sequels, remakes, and reimaginings a lot this year on the show. And while the lack of originality pouring through our media tubes can make us run for the hills, they've become so enmeshed in our popular culture, it can be difficult to avoid, especially when one hits particularly close to home. Growing up in the late 80s and early 90s gave me an opportunity to witness some truly amazing milestones in animation. I am absolutely aware and appreciative of this. You know who else is aware? Corporations. If you walk into any number of retail stores these days, you'll almost assuredly find modern merchandise for the landmark shows of 25 years ago. That's because the powers that be have made it their business model to turn the Generation X childhood into a cash cow. In some ways, like the 2017 Jumanji reboot, this has been incredibly successful. But sometimes there comes a show that misses the mark so much, it actually offends the original viewer base. And while the internet has shown the world how easily people do get offended, this time, they may actually be onto something. I was 13 in 1994, and this was a truly special time in the world of animation. It was a time before internet, cell phones, and certainly animated computer-generated imagery, or CGI, had become commonplace. We were still sharing content via floppy disk, for Pete's sake. There was something of a mystique surrounding computers themselves as they gradually became a staple of the American household. In this budding digital landscape, a gem emerged that promised to take its audience to fantastic worlds only previously dreamed of. And it came in the form of ReBoot. a half-hour Canadian animated cartoon made entirely using CGI. While this is something that is no longer considered noteworthy, you have to understand this was over a year before Pixar's first Toy Story film was even in theaters, which made ReBoot the first of its kind. Although tonight's primary focus is on its successor, to provide a bit of context, here's a brief rundown, or download, on ReBoot. That big metal box known as a desktop that many people have since replaced with tablets, laptops, and even phones is actually home to a microscopic world. That's right, you've got mail, men, and other various people inside your computer. This probably sounds familiar to fans of the Disney franchise known as Tron. There are a few Tron fans still out there, right? Right? Tron is the story of a man, or user, who gets sucked into a world inside his computer, where he must compete in violently destructive games in order to escape. And of course, we can't forget the 2010 sequel, where the less reputable inhabitants of that computer world threaten to enter the human world to wreak havoc. But why am I talking about Tron? Let's get back to ReBoot, a show about how a user causes destruction on the inhabitants of a computer world by playing games. Oh, right. Despite any similarities to other properties, ReBoot was a fantastic production. The series featured memorable characters who evolved over time, healthy doses of humor, and lots of fun adventure along the way. Its protagonist was a guardian named Bob, and chronicled his mission to look after the residents of Mainframe, a city comprised of binomes, the comically literal interpretations of ones and zeros, and his friends Fong, Dot Matrix, and her kid brother Enzo. Occasionally, an unseen character known simply as the user would start a game which would drop a massive purple swirling cube randomly in the middle of Mainframe. Anyone caught inside the cube would then be transported into whatever game was being played, and unless the user was defeated, our animated pals would be nullified. This made Mainframe a somewhat dangerous place to live. If that wasn't bad enough, our heroes also had to deal with viruses, in this case, an evil sibling pair known as Megabyte and Hexadecimal. This groundbreaking series, full of pop culture references and tons of personality, ended in late 2001 with a final count of 48 episodes. I think the appeal of the original show is, in a way, related to the steampunk stories of Jules Verne. It's this utopian vision of the future that's all geometric, shiny, and imaginative. Film series like The Mind's Eye captured this perfectly and were hugely inspirational to me around the same time of ReBoot's original release. And here we find ourselves in 2018, 25 years after the debut of such a well-loved piece of animation history. The company responsible for ReBoot was appropriately called Mainframe Entertainment Incorporated, and has since been bought out and assimilated into Rainmaker Studios. The studio has even created 2 feature films, Ratchet and Clank and Escape from Planet Earth. In 2012, a man by the name of Michael Hefferon became president of and executive producer for Rainmaker. Hefferon was bound and determined to bring forth a new series that would capitalize on the success of ReBoot, even though his peers advised against it. Of course, the fans of ReBoot have had just one thing on their minds since 2001, and that is the triumphant return of their beloved show. So, when news came that a reimagined series was coming to Netflix in the spring of 2018, naturally there was a lot of buzz. The new show would be titled ReBoot, The Guardian Code, and the first 10 episodes premiered this March, with the remaining 10 treated as a second season to be saved for fall release. The showrunner for this series would conveniently be none other than Rainmaker president Michael Heffron. Heffron had this to say regarding the reimagined series. Quote, "While ReBoot was an amazing show, I think the biggest thing to come out of it was the CG pipeline, the technology that was used to make it. ReBoot and Mainframe Entertainment played a huge part in building the CG animation industry here in Vancouver. So the question was, how could we make the new ReBoot as inspiring and innovative as the original? Just moving the story 20-odd years into the future wasn't going to be enough, because there are plenty of other computer-animated shows now. The show we eventually created is certainly inspired by the original ReBoot, but I don't think of it as a reboot. Rather, we tried to imagine that ReBoot had never been made, and we were making it for the first time for today's audience." End quote. Oh boy, after so many years of waiting and observing a seemingly endless supply of revivals coming out of Hollywood, finally, ReBoot was getting its time in the spotlight once more. And the first thing I noticed upon playing episode 1 was it wasn't animated? That's right, this loosely inspired sequel to ReBoot has become a teen drama that occasionally features animated action sequences. But you know what? I am open to new interpretations and am willing to give pretty much any show a chance. It's all too easy to fall into the fanboy trap when a reimagining doesn't stay 100% true to the source material. This is something I refuse to do. Okay, so we've got kids in high school and it's the first day. We're introduced to our heroes right away, which I'm sorry to say are the very definition of stereotypes. The nerd, the jock, the pretty boy leader, and the token ditzy girl. Not a great start, but I remained hopeful as I watched these 4 students receive a mysterious text message directing them to Classroom 0 in the basement of tech school Alan Turing High. There, they discover a holographic wall that leads to a hidden room which is somehow in pristine condition. As they explore what appears to be a combination computer lab and control center, these 4 extremely unlikely friends gradually walk up to a platform. That platform transports them inside what they assume is some sort of virtual reality video game. Not just any video game, but the incredibly popular Cyber Guardians, which they all happen to be really good at playing. Here, they encounter cyber locusts filled with dark code and the virus known as Megabyte, all of which threaten to endanger cyberspace and, by proxy, the literal world. Megabyte is the same antagonist from the original series with a new coat of paint and is somehow considered an upgrade, even though the previous model had more capacity for facial expression. Megabyte has been reactivated by possibly the worst part of this new series, and that is the villain known as the Sorcerer. Like source code and wizard mixed together. Get it? Played by Bob Fraser, this filthy, abandoned warehouse-dwelling, cockroach-eating creep's greatest contribution to the story is merely providing a running monologue explaining his every intention. The play-by-play wouldn't be so bad if the casting had been better. Honestly, between the poor line delivery and lazy writing, those warehouse scenes couldn't end fast enough for me. The kids learned that the video game they've been playing on their phones was merely the Guardian Code ReBoot program, and that their Phase 1 training was this game. The program was activated once dark code was discovered, and the kids were alerted in kind. Excuse me while I put down this copy of The Last Starfighter, and let's move on to animation, shall we? Despite how badly the Guardian Code draws inspiration from shows like Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, in that it just feels like a cheap carbon copy, it doesn't succeed here either. It's a case of poor execution that's more like intellectual property appropriation and less a respectable sequel. It's true, I was initially perturbed at how the Guardian Code wasn't a completely animated show, but this was only compounded by just how little animation there is, period. The original reboot was bright, cheerfully colored, and slick was a bright, cheerfully colored, and slick achievement in animation, especially considering being the first of its kind. That series even played with squash and stretch cartoon logic, sometimes to its detriment, but still inventively. The Guardian Code's animation is reminiscent of its predecessor, but something is very off. For starters, the cartoon approach is almost entirely gone, which means everything is permanently rigid, and for some reason, nearly every environment is just dark. I mean, really, who turned out the lights? I know it's cyberspace, but it doesn't need to feel like the vacant void of actual outer space, does it? The color palette is mostly deep navies and maroons, which doesn't read well together at all. The biggest problem with the Guardian Code is how sterile it feels. Without an emphasis on wonder or the fantastic, what remains is quite literally a void. Heffron wants the audience to feel connected to the animated avatars of our lead characters. To do this, the action constantly cuts back to the real-life faces of the actors with a floating virtual display representing their vantage from inside the helmets. Look, I get it. The rainbow-colored robots are the kids, but cutting back and forth is jarring and super distracting. I will say this, the occasional first-person shots were a nice video game tie-in, but can also feel disorienting when used in abundance. Heffron mentioned this is the first series to be completely animated using the Unreal Engine. Now, for those who don't know what that means, Unreal is the software responsible for some of the most successful video games available. But that doesn't make it a proper tool for a TV show, especially when you consider that CG pipeline from his earlier statement. Remember how he said the best thing to come from ReBoot was the technology? You know, the same technology ignored when making the Guardian Code? Why on earth would such a decision be made? The original series, while somewhat rudimentary given its humble origins, still holds up visually. Better, in fact. That's because they were trying to push the envelope with the available technology of the time. Now, Rainmaker puts aside technology that is literally 25 years into the future in exchange for a novelty bragging right? This makes me wonder if there was some sort of corporate arrangement behind the scenes providing financial support for such a creative diversion. I'm not saying this show has to be as fun and spirited as the 90s series, but honestly, where is the fun? I mean, these kids are in high school, but somehow even the more lighthearted moments come off about as enjoyable as a funeral procession. It seems fairly obvious that the minds behind this series haven't got a handle on the heart of what made ReBoot so successful. That being said, the Guardian Code, like most television series, wasn't created in a vacuum, despite how often it feels like we're hanging out in one. And I believe there are a few bright spots inside this dark space. The character of Vera, played by Hannah Vanderbygart, really surprised me. In the very first episode, Vera, a being from within the computer world manifested in human form, becomes a fish out of water as she tries to adapt to life as a teenager. The concept of AI coming to terms with humanity isn't a new one in science fiction, and yet Vandenbygart does a pleasantly honest take on this, especially given her young age and being a relatively new face to TV. Her voice work is spot on and calls to mind the likes of Siri and Alexa as our own modern manifestations of female virtual assistants. I'm sorry to say that the rest of the performances range from mediocre to downright embarrassing. I'd like to think this is mostly attributed to the writing and editing, because these young actors do show some promise. In the end, I was rooting more for Megabyte and Hexadecimal than the heroes, because somehow they managed to remain remarkably true to their roots. Shirley Miller reprised her role as Hexadecimal and was music to my ears. It's obvious how much she still loves this character and truly embodies this unhinged villainess. Timothy Drummond takes over for the late Tony Jay as Megabyte and is a standout performance in the series. Unfortunately, the character of Megabyte, persecuted by the Sorcerer, is restricted for most of the first season. Watching such a worthy adversary being held back in a submissive role was more annoying than interesting. To round out the show, the music sets the tone, but in this case, it's not enough to save it. The original reboot had an epic opening theme song, but now that's been removed. Remember how I mentioned similarities between this show and Tron? Well, that goes double for the score. Upon hearing the electronic-inspired themes composed by Rich Walters, I was immediately reminded of the work by Daft Punk for Tron Legacy. I absolutely love that score, and so the work of Walters certainly got me in the mood. It is dark, foreboding, and builds tension. The problem here is not the music. The series fails to put its money where its modem is, so the tension builds, but not to anywhere exciting. Because of the show's inability to make us feel for these characters, and its extremely heavy mood, darker music also weighs the show down. This is, of course, no fault of Walters, and I would rather listen to the soundtrack without the visuals. Look, I wanted to enjoy this series. I'm okay with change. I know this isn't the same show I grew up with, but these are not the ramblings of a whiny fanboy. It isn't just me either. The response to the series online has been absolutely abysmal. All across social media, the hashtag #NotMyReboot has been circling ever since the trailer for the Guardian Code was released. In countries where the remaining 10 episodes have already aired, the response is that it's merely more of the same from season 1, which is disheartening, but I can't say I'm surprised. One of the more common statements I found was how this series seems to have heavily borrowed from a 2003 French animated show called Code Lyoko. Now, truth be told, I've never watched that series, but let's just check out the description from good old IMDb.com. I mean, how similar could it be, right? Quote, when a group of 4 boarding school students discover a supercomputer housed inside an abandoned factory, they find a virtual world and awaken a sentient, multi-agent system virus that tries to take over the real world, end quote. Oh, geez, that's just, wow. Perhaps the biggest nail in the digital coffin is the 10th episode, ironically entitled Mainframe Mayhem. This divisive episode is worth discussing because quite literally, this is what fans were waiting for. A chance to have their favorite characters return and maybe relive a little of the spark that started it all. That's not exactly what was delivered. Sure, Bob, Dot, Enzo, and even his dog Frisket were back, with Kathleen Barr and Michael Benier reprising their roles. But something is very wrong about this reunion. Not only is Enzo aged back down to his season 1 child self, but everyone's faces look reduced. By that I mean they've lost most of their expressiveness and almost come across like soulless mannequins. And that little speech Bob used to give at the start of the old show, he now regurgitates in casual conversation as he is meeting the new Guardians. I get that it was meant to be a throwback, but it made him seem, well, like a non-thinking computer program. These are the same characters that had so much life in that original series. In an effort to create a humorous nod to the loyal reboot fanbase, the pendulum swung in the opposite direction. They finally reveal the user. That's right, the character who never was from the 90s show. The person responsible for sending Bob and company into game after destructive game. Who is this user? Apparently, he's us, or at least a cheap caricature of who Rainmaker assumes is their fan base. A bearded 40-something loser who admits to living in his mother's basement, which he adorned with merchandise from the original series. This bizarre breaking of the fourth wall comes absolutely out of left field, and that is my least favorite way to do such things because it's so out of place. It's not funny to fans. If anything, it's an insult. And that is precisely the way it has been perceived by those who even bothered to watch this far. What makes this wink to the viewers so cringeworthy is that each episode spits in the face of what made the original show so lovable, and as a final cherry on top of season 1, we are shown a funhouse mirror reflecting what the series creators think about us. A tribute this was not. Granted, I know it's all in jest, but the joke doesn't land, because it refuses to read the room. A room that has just watched 10 episodes of soulless teen drama posing as an action-adventure series. The concept of finally showing users as kids and having them interact with the familiar characters we grew up with isn't a bad one. In fact, I would go so far as to say it's similar to the entire reason Robin was created for Batman, to give younger audiences someone to relate to as they went on adventures with the Dark Knight. Here's the deal about the user, though. In the original show, we were already the user. It was a fun twist on casual PC gaming, because apparently our geeky pastime was affecting a whole world inside the computer itself. This provided a sort of consequence to gaming and made us think about things a little differently. Though these teens are the supposed touchstone for this reimagined mainframe, when a loser persona is presented as the former show's audience, regardless of tongue-in-cheek, how could anyone not take that as a complete slap to the face? Lastly, it's revealed that the computer our heroes have been adventuring in for the whole first season was merely tucked away in the back of Room Zero. Because it's been in standby mode for years, this is the reason the animated portions have been so dark all this time. Really? So we had to sit through a muddy-colored, drab digital equivalent to undersea exploration because a simple switch needed to be flipped? And to add insult to injury, the character of Tamra even refers to mainframe as, quote, ancient technology 1 retro, end quote. Nice. Who is this series even for? Hefferon states he made sure to put a special focus on a coinciding VR experience for kids. The idea here is that viewers can relive the virtual environments and action from the series in 1-minute 3D vignettes. There's even an app that listens to your surroundings, and depending on the episode of the Guardian Code that's playing in the background, new challenges unlock in a game. You know what? Kudos for innovation and building some real interactivity. But without a doubt, I would have traded it all if that energy could have been rerouted into the production standards of the series itself. Too dreary for the most emo of teens, and too tedious for anyone else, ReBoot the Guardian Code is not a show I can recommend spending your time on. Newcomers, I imagine, will give it a hearty shoulder shrug, and as a longtime fan of the classic series, it just made me want to go back and rewatch that show. You want to create something groundbreaking that engages children and families? Great. But when you ride the coattails of a proven classic, just remember that isn't a free pass to ignore basic rules of quality expected from any production. The remaining 10 episodes already completed will come to Netflix this fall, which means it's already too late. We can only hope the creators take heed of this backlash beyond that second season. Until then, it's probably best if that hidden light switch was simply turned off once more. As always, we're about to take a short intermission where we'll listen to a little music from tonight's feature. That was a selection of score from ReBoot, The Guardian Code, composed by Rich Walters. While Walters already had a successful career as a media composer for shows such as Sci-Fi's Van Helsing, this is his first foray into the world of animation. Despite the final results of the show itself, I'd say a live-action animation hybrid project was a very appropriate crossing over point for him, and he handled it well. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Thanks to all of you listening in live on YouTube. And say, if you enjoyed the show and would like to listen anytime, why don't you join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/Phil Machi and become a subscriber today. Not only are there cool rewards, but you can also stream this show anytime you like, which means never missing an episode. I've been Phil Machi, you've been a wonderful audience, and until next time, keep those eyeballs peeled, those ears open, and be sure to stay tuned. Alrighty, thank you so much for being here for that scripted part of the show. If you're still here, stick around. This is the after party. And basically, if you have any questions or if there were things you posted during the show, I couldn't see the comments. So if there's anything you want to talk about now, feel free to put those comments and I will read them for everybody and address them appropriately.